The late autumn sun hung low over Camp Ruston, Louisiana on November 4, 1945. A chill wind carried the scent of pine from the surrounding woods, rattling the tin roofs of the barracks where hundreds of German prisoners of war waited under watch. That afternoon, a convoy of buses arrived carrying a group unlike the guards had ever seen before. They were not hardened Wehrmacht soldiers or captured U-boat crews, but 32 women in worn grey uniforms, their faces pale, their bodies lean from years of rationing. The camp had been restructured to accommodate them, a rare sight in America. German female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht transported across the Atlantic after capture in the final months of the war. Most were communications clerks, medical assistants, or administrative staff. Among them was 24-year-old Hilda Bauer from Dresden, whose diary would one day reveal the quiet astonishment of that arrival. "We expected punishment," she wrote. "The journey was long, and we whispered that the Americans would humiliate us. We were told they were cruel, that they despised us. Instead, when we stepped down from the bus, a woman in uniform smiled at me. She spoke in clear German. 'Welcome, you are safe now.' My knees shook more at those words than at any bombing raid." That woman was Captain Margaret Lewis of the Women's Army Corps. The WWII had been assigned to manage this special unit of female POWs. The symbolism was deliberate. The US Army believed women would adapt more easily when supervised by American women rather than male guards. No one expected the cultural confrontation that would unfold. Inside the barracks, Hilda and her companions were shown bunks with clean sheets. A stove glowed with steady heat. On the nightstand, folded neatly, was a packet that stunned them more than the beds themselves. Soap, a toothbrush, and, most shockingly, a small tube of red lipstick. The women stared in silence. For 3 years in Germany, lipstick had vanished from stores, reserved for the wives of senior party officials or actresses favoured by Goebbels' propaganda ministry. To receive it as prisoners of war felt absurd. One woman, Greta Klein, whispered, "It must be poisoned. They want us to make fools of ourselves." Another clutched it as though it were contraband, certain the guards would reclaim it at any moment. But the WWII sergeant who distributed the kits laughed softly. "No tricks, it's yours. Use it or don't as you please. In America, every woman has one." That sentence echoed like thunder. Every woman has one. The following morning brought another shock. After roll call, the prisoners were escorted to a recreation hall. Tables were stacked with donated magazines, Ladies' Home Journal, Vogue, Life. Their covers shone with smiling women in tailored dresses, advertisements for refrigerators, bright kitchens, families eating roast dinners. Hilda picked one up gingerly. Her hands trembled as she turned the glossy pages, each one a window into a life utterly foreign to the grey, bomb-scarred Germany she had left behind. "They live like this in war?" she whispered to her friend Erica. "We were told they were starving, that their cities were collapsing. Look, this woman wears pearls just to wash dishes." For days, the barracks buzzed with disbelief. Some women scoffed, insisting the magazines were fakes produced as propaganda. Others, like Hilda, couldn't look away. "I studied the advertisements," she later wrote. "Refrigerators taller than a man, canned goods stacked endlessly, fabrics and shoes in abundance. If it was deception, it was too detailed, too ordinary to be a lie." The lipstick became a symbol of the revelation. Women who had not smiled in months began tracing shaky crimson lines across their lips. Some wept at the sight of themselves in the mirror, remembering youth before scarcity had stripped them of femininity. Yet for many, the gesture was not joy, but devastation. Erika Müller, a former secretary from Hamburg, broke down one evening after applying the lipstick. "All those speeches," she sobbed, "all those years they told us we were superior, and here in the enemy's prison we are given what our Reich could never provide." Captain Lewis noticed the change immediately. In her report she wrote, "These women are not defeated by guards or fences, but by soap, lipstick and magazines. They measure their deprivation against our abundance, and in doing so, their certainty crumbles. By the second week, the WWII introduced structured activities. English lessons, sewing classes, even film screenings were offered. The first film the German women saw was Meet Me in St. Louis. They sat in stunned silence as Judy Garland sang of trolley rides and Christmas parties. For women who had huddled in bomb shelters as their cities burned, the normalcy felt like science fiction. Afterward, Hilda wrote, "I walked back to the barracks in silence. They live in a different world, one where war is background noise, not devastation. I don't know which is harder to bear, that we were lied to, or that we believed it so easily." The POWs began writing letters home. Though censored, the letters carried hints of their revelations. "We are treated fairly," one wrote to her mother in Munich. "We even have soap and other things." Another described the magazines but cautioned, "If I told you everything, you would not believe me." What none of them dared admit openly was how those small gifts, the lipstick tubes, the glossy magazines, had become tools of quiet education. They did not shout ideology or lecture about democracy. They simply showed a world where abundance was normal, where femininity was preserved even in wartime, where women laughed, worked, and consumed without fear. For the German women, the realization was both intoxicating and unbearable. And it was only the beginning. The second week of captivity changed everything for the German women at Camp Ruston. What had begun as disbelief, the lipstick tubes tucked into toiletry kits, the glossy magazines stacked casually on tables, was evolving into something deeper, a steady dismantling of their world view. They had expected to be broken by punishment. Instead, they were undone by abundance. Each morning began with roll call, but unlike the barked orders of their homeland, the American women spoke firmly yet calmly. The WWIIs insisted on discipline, but coupled it with dignity. Prisoners were not forced to stand in the cold for hours. Instead, they were counted quickly, then directed to breakfast. Trays clattered with eggs, toast, and steaming coffee. Some mornings even brought fruit, bananas, oranges, luxuries most of the prisoners had not seen in years. For women who had survived on watery cabbage soup in Hamburg or scraps of potato peelings in Dresden, the meals felt surreal. One prisoner, Lotta, whispered to her bunkmate, "If this is captivity, what must freedom look like?" Lipstick and identity. The lipstick distributed that first night became more than a cosmetic item. It was a mirror, a reminder of what war had stolen from them. At first, many resisted, believing it a trap or mockery. But within days, crimson stains began appearing on lips across the barracks. Women would huddle around a shard of mirror nailed to the wall, applying the color with shaking hands. Some laughed nervously, others wept. Erika, who had once been a typist in Hamburg, stared at her reflection and whispered, "I look like a woman again, not a ghost." Captain Margaret Lewis, observing from a distance, recognized the shift. In her report to superiors, she wrote, "The provision of lipstick may seem trivial, but it has had profound psychological effects. It restores their sense of humanity, and at the same time highlights, for German women raised in a society where female ambition was confined to motherhood or auxiliary roles, the sight was bewildering." One evening, after English lessons, Hilda asked their instructor, a young WWII named Corporal Helen Brooks, how many women served in the U.S. Army. Helen smiled. "More than 150,000. Gasps rippled across the classroom. One prisoner blurted out, "Impossible! Women do not fight." Helen shrugged. "We drive trucks, repair planes, decode messages. We do what needs to be done." That single conversation ignited days of debate in the barracks. Some women scoffed, clinging to the belief that women should never hold authority. Others whispered excitedly about possibilities they had never imagined. For Hilda, it was a revelation. "If American women can serve as soldiers," she wrote, "what else can they do that we have been denied?" Film night. On the third Saturday of their captivity, the WWIIs organized a film screening. The chosen movie was Meet Me in St. Louis, starring Judy Garland. The prisoners shuffled into the recreation hall, wary. But as the film unfolded, children singing on Christmas Eve, families gathering around tables laden with food, the women grew silent. For them, the war had turned holidays into nights of fear and hunger. To watch a family on screen laugh, decorate a tree and sing felt both joyous and painful. Some wiped tears silently. Afterward, Erica confessed, "I thought it was fantasy, but the magazines show the same tables, the same clothes. Perhaps this is their reality." Psychological collapse. With every revelation came crisis. Not all prisoners welcomed these glimpses of American abundance. For some, it triggered despair. Greta, who had clung to Nazi propaganda, grew withdrawn. She refused to touch the lipstick, calling it a humiliation. She accused the Americans of staging everything. But even she could not ignore the steady supply of food, the constant arrival of magazines, the casual luxury of soap. Dr. Eleanor Stillman, the camp psychiatrist, noted in her assessment, "The more intelligent and observant the prisoner, the sharper the crisis. They realize that propaganda painted Americans as weak and decadent, yet here they see resilience and wealth. This collapse of certainty is more effective than any interrogation." One afternoon, the WWII allowed several women into the camp library. Rows of English books lined the shelves. Among them were novels, encyclopedias, even cookbooks. Hilda picked up a book on American agriculture, flipping through diagrams of tractors and irrigation systems. She whispered, "One farm here must produce more than 10 of ours." Beside her, Erica studied a home economics manual. She pointed at a section on canned goods. "They preserve fruit for winter. We rationed jam for years, but here they have factories for it." These discoveries spread quickly through the barracks. Women began compiling their own intelligence reports, listing everything they observed: the quantity of milk, the number of light bulbs, the volume of magazines. Major Domoto in Part 1 had inspired a similar effort in Japanese camps, and now the German women followed the same path. By late December, the lipstick had sparked a fierce internal debate. Was it a symbol of humiliation, a reminder that they were women reduced to decoration? Or was it liberation, proof that even in captivity they could reclaim what war had stripped away? One night, Hilda stood before the group and said softly, "We wore uniforms because they told us it was duty. We abandoned dresses, lipstick and beauty because they said it was weakness. But look, the Americans give it back freely, even to prisoners. Maybe it is not weakness, but strength." Silence followed. Slowly, others nodded. The turning point came on Christmas Eve. The WWII organized a small celebration in the mess hall. A pine tree stood decorated with paper ornaments. Each prisoner received a small parcel: socks, a bar of chocolate, and another tube of lipstick. Tears flowed freely. Chocolate had vanished from German shelves years before. To taste it again was overwhelming. Some women saved pieces to mail home, though censors would confiscate most. Others ate in silence, eyes shut, savoring every bite. That night, the women sang carols softly in German, their voices mingling with faint strains of American hymns drifting from the guards' quarters. Hilda wrote in her diary, "For the first time, I do not feel like an enemy. I feel like a woman among women, human again." In January 1946, prisoners were permitted another round of letters. Though heavily censored, their words carried hidden truths. One wrote, "We are treated kindly, more than I can explain. They give us things we had not seen in years." Another confessed, "I saw magazines filled with abundance. If I wrote all, you would not believe." The irony was cruel. In bombed-out Germany, families survived on thin rations. To hear that their daughters, imprisoned in America, lived with soap, chocolate, and magazines would have been incomprehensible. Seeds of transformation. By February, the effects were undeniable. The prisoners walked with more confidence, spoke with more curiosity, even argued passionately about politics. They debated democracy, women's rights, and the possibility of peace. The lipstick tubes had become symbols, tiny torches lighting the path out of indoctrination. Corporal Brooks noted, "They ask questions daily now, about schools, about work, about wages for women. Their hunger is not only for food, but for knowledge. The magazines may have done more than we realize." For the German women, captivity had become a classroom. And every lesson, every page, every crimson smile chipped away at the empire of lies they had once believed. The new year of 1946 dawned grey and uncertain for the women of Camp Ruston. Though the war had ended months before, their captivity lingered. Yet, unlike their male counterparts who often resented every day behind barbed wire, the German women began to realize that these months were transforming them in ways they had never anticipated. The lipstick and magazines had already reawakened something long suppressed, the simple sense of identity beyond uniforms and orders. But with each passing week, captivity reshaped them further. They noticed their posture changing. No longer did they shuffle like shadows through barracks. They held their heads higher, their steps lighter. Even the WWII noticed. Corporal Helen Brooks wrote in a report to her commander, "The Germans arrived terrified, hollow-eyed and suspicious. Now they chatter amongst themselves, tease one another, and even thank us. They laugh again. The simple act of putting colour on their lips seems to have restored colour to their spirits." But the transformation was not just cosmetic. It was intellectual. Every evening after chores, the barracks became a salon of debate. Piles of Vogue, Ladies' Home Journal, and Life circulated from bunk to bunk, passed like sacred texts. They dissected the advertisements, electric refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, gleaming cars, and argued whether they were propaganda or truth. Hilda, always thoughtful, insisted they represented reality. "These magazines are dated. Look, June, September, November. They cannot print these just for us." Greta scoffed. "Do you not see? This is the deception. They want us to believe in abundance." But even Greta's protests weakened when newer magazines arrived by mail each week, bundled casually as though the supply were endless. Pages filled with smiling children in Halloween costumes, women in department stores, soldiers returning home to parades. The debates grew deeper. What did it mean that Americans had so much, even in wartime, when Germany had so little? Could spirit alone truly compete with machines and production? Was their suffering noble sacrifice or deliberate deceit? By March 1946, the library at Camp Ruston had become a focal point. At first, only a few women ventured inside. Soon, dozens gathered daily. They borrowed books on American history, agriculture, and medicine. English primers circulated, and soon prisoners scribbled words into makeshift notebooks. Hilda practiced each evening. Table, chair, apple, freedom. Erica, more daring, began translating entire paragraphs. "We must learn their tongue," she insisted. "The world belongs to those who can speak across borders." The WWII encouraged this. Some even sat with the women, correcting pronunciation. For the prisoners, it was both humiliation and revelation. They had been taught Americans were crude and uneducated. Instead, these young women carried themselves with poise, spoke multiple languages, and held authority with ease. One evening, Sergeant Margaret Lewis, the camp's senior officer, visited the library. She watched quietly as prisoners bent over books, lips moving as they sounded out English words. Later, she told her staff, "These women will return to Germany not as they came. They are witnessing a system built not on fear but on function, and they are learning. Mark my words, they will become seeds of change." The lipstick, once controversial, had by now become routine. Every morning women lined up before the mirror shard, applying colour before roll call. Some experimented, blending shades, even daring to mimic the glossy magazine covers. For them, it was no longer about beauty alone. It was defiance, against the war that had reduced them to shadows, against the propaganda that stripped them of joy. To wear lipstick was to reclaim ownership of their bodies, their identities, their choices. One prisoner, Marta, summed it up. They wanted us to be soldiers without weapons, but here, with lipstick, I feel I fight in another way. I fight to remain myself. When spring arrived, camp administrators allowed limited outdoor activities. Gardening plots were assigned. The women planted rows of beans, lettuce, and flowers. For those who had endured bombed-out cities, the sight of green shoots rising from soil felt miraculous. The Americans provided seeds without hesitation. In Germany, Hilda remarked, such seeds are hoarded like gold. Here they hand them to prisoners as if they were pebbles. The act of gardening sparked another revelation. Supplies seemed inexhaustible. Tools, gloves, watering cans, everything arrived in abundance. The women began to realize that America's wealth extended beyond food and fashion. It reached into the very soil, the infrastructure, the daily life. Yet not all accepted these lessons. Greta and a small group clung stubbornly to old beliefs. They refused to wear lipstick, avoided the library, and muttered that it was all a trick. Tension simmered between the two groups. One night a fierce argument erupted. Greta accused Hilda of betrayal. "You forget who you are. You forget your homeland." Hilda stood firm. "No, I remember. That is why I see clearer now. They lied to us. Here, even as prisoners, we live better than our families at home." The barracks fell silent. For many, the argument captured the war within their own hearts, loyalty to a homeland versus acknowledgement of undeniable truth. In May 1946, representatives from the Red Cross visited Camp Ruston. They inspected barracks, tasted food, and interviewed prisoners privately. Their verdict was glowing. Conditions exceeded international standards. The women received parcels, soap, chocolate, and letters from home. But the letters were heartbreaking. Families described hunger, bombed houses, illnesses untreated. Some mothers begged for food, others asked desperately if their daughters lived. The women wept. They realized the cruel paradox. As prisoners of war, they lived in greater comfort than their loved ones in freedom. For many, guilt weighed heavily. Hilda confessed in her diary, "I sleep in a clean bed while my mother sleeps on rubble. I eat meat while she starves. How can I return to her?" The true transformation crystallized not in books or food, but in daily observation of the WWII. These American women commanded respect, gave orders to men, and lived independently. They drove jeeps, managed records, and carried pistols at their sides. To the German prisoners, it was a revelation. They had been taught that women's value lay in motherhood, obedience, and sacrifice. Yet here, women wore authority like a uniform, and no one questioned it. One afternoon, Erica approached Corporal Brooks and asked timidly, "Do you return home after this to husband and children?" Helen laughed. "Maybe one day, but for now I serve my country, and that is enough." The answer rippled through the prisoners like a shockwave. A woman could choose service, independence, identity. For the first time, many began to imagine a different life beyond Germany's ruins. By autumn 1946, repatriation began. The women would be shipped back to a shattered homeland. The Americans prepared farewell parcels, setters, OAP, magazines, lipstick, and small cakes for the journey. On the last night, the WWII hosted a modest ceremony. They sang songs, offered handshakes, and wished the women well. Tears blurred the room. Hilda wrote, "They conquered us not with weapons, but with kindness. Their lipstick gave us back our faces. Their magazines gave us new dreams. Their example gave us courage." Arrival in Germany was a shock. The women stepped from ships into cities of rubble. Families greeted them with tears, but also suspicion. Many could not comprehend their stories of soap and magazines, of lipstick and ice cream. Some neighbors whispered that they must have collaborated. Others envied their healthy appearance. For years, silence cloaked many of their experiences. To speak of abundance in captivity felt like betrayal to those who had starved. Yet seeds had been planted. The women carried back ideas about freedom, about abundance, about what society could be. Some became teachers, others nurses, a few even journalists. Slowly their stories surfaced, shaping post-war Germany's reconstruction. Decades later, historians would look back and marvel at the strange paradox. While bombs destroyed German cities, while propaganda painted Americans as barbarians, German women behind barbed wire were discovering another truth. Lipstick had restored dignity, magazines had revealed abundance, American women had modeled independence. These simple things, cosmetics, paper, conversation, proved more powerful than weapons. Hilda, in a 1972 interview, summed it up. Our defeat was sealed long before, but our rebirth began in captivity. With lipstick on our lips and magazines in our hands, we glimpsed another world. We realized our chains were not only physical, but in our minds. And in that American camp, they began to break. The story of the German female POWs at Camp Ruston is not one of cruelty, but of unexpected humanity. They expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps death,